Most Americans never buy diesel, but they still pay for it. Most Americans do not buy diesel every week. They may never stop at a diesel pump. They may never drive a tractor-trailer, operate farm equipment, or run heavy machinery. But diesel is still built into the cost of everyday life. It helps move groceries to stores. It carries retail goods across the country. It supports construction, farming, delivery networks, warehouses, refrigerated trailers, and parts of the food supply chain. That is why diesel prices matter even to households that never buy diesel directly. As of May 11, 2026, the U.S. Energy Information Administration listed the national average price for on-highway diesel at $5.63.9 per gallon. That was nearly unchanged from the previous week, but it was $2.16.3 higher than a year earlier. For truckers and carriers, diesel is a direct operating cost. For everyone else, it can become an indirect cost. It can move through freight contracts, fuel surcharges, delivery costs, distribution networks, retail prices, food logistics, construction materials, and small business expenses. The impact is not always visible. A grocery receipt does not show a separate line for diesel. A store shelf does not list the cost of freight fuel. But the cost can still be present, folded into the system that moves goods from one place to another. That is diesel's hidden role in the economy. It is not the only reason prices rise. It does not explain every grocery bill, every delivery fee, or every construction cost. But it is one of the main transportation costs behind the economy households depend on. The current diesel data shows why that matters. On May 11, 2026, EIA listed the national on-highway diesel price at $5.63.9 per gallon. 1 week earlier, it had been $5.64. The weekly change was only 1/10 of a cent lower. The year-over-year change was much larger. Diesel was $2.16.3 higher than 1 year earlier. That annual increase matters because trucking, distribution, farming, construction, and delivery networks do not operate on one tank of fuel. They operate continuously. A higher diesel price becomes a repeated cost, week after week, mile after mile. The pressure was also uneven across the country. EIA listed West Coast diesel at $6.562 per gallon. In California, the average was $7.32.1 per gallon. That regional difference matters because businesses operating in high-cost fuel markets may face a different cost structure than businesses elsewhere. A delivery route, freight contract, farm operation, or distribution center in a high-cost region can face more pressure than the national average suggests. For consumers, that regional difference may not be obvious. A household may only see a higher shelf price, a delivery charge, or a more expensive service call. But for the business moving the goods, the fuel cost is direct. The freight data points in the same direction. In the first quarter of 2026, the U.S. Bank Freight Payment Index showed national shipment volume edged down 0.3% from the fourth quarter of 2025. Shipper spending, however, rose 12.9% over the same period. Compared with the first quarter of 2025, shipments rose only 0.6%. Spending climbed 21.8%. That gap is important. Freight spending rose sharply, even though freight volume barely moved. The increase was not simply the result of more goods being shipped. As Bank said, the higher spending reflected tighter capacity, higher rates, and rising fuel surcharges. For businesses, that creates a more difficult planning environment. Transportation costs can rise even when shipment volumes are not growing much. For households, that pressure can eventually appear in the prices of goods and services that depend on trucking. Bob Koslow, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the American Trucking Associations, described the market as being reshaped by supply, not demand. He was describing a freight environment where rates and spending were rising while volume showed little change. Bobby Holland, Director of Freight Business Analytics at U.S. Bank, also noted how abruptly costs moved higher even though freight activity itself did not. Those statements describe a cost problem, not simply a demand problem. If businesses were shipping far more goods, higher freight spending would be easier to explain. But when volume is mostly flat and spending rises sharply, The pressure is coming from the cost of moving goods, not from a major increase in movement itself. Diesel is one part of that cost. The structure of diesel pricing shows why it can be affected by several forces at once. EIA's February 2026 diesel cost breakdown showed that crude oil accounted for 41% of the retail diesel price. Refining accounted for 23%. Distribution and marketing accounted for 21%. Taxes accounted for 16%. A gallon of diesel is not shaped by one factor. It reflects crude oil markets, refinery economics, distribution costs, marketing costs, and taxes. For a trucking company, the final price is what matters. The truck has to be fueled. The route has to be completed. The load has to be delivered. For the broader economy, the layers behind that gallon explain how fuel pressure can spread. A higher crude oil cost can raise the base. Refining conditions can affect the finished product. Distribution and marketing can affect regional pricing. Taxes remain part of the final price. Together, those pieces create a cost paid across the freight system. Diesel is different from a consumer gasoline story. Gasoline is visible because drivers see the price on signs along the road. Diesel is less visible to many households, but it sits deeper inside the movement of goods. Trucks are central to that movement. ATA data republished by IRU showed that trucking represented 72.7% of tonnage carried by all domestic freight modes, including manufactured and retail goods. Trucks hauled 11.27 billion tons of freight in 2024. Motor carriers collected $906 billion, equal to 76.9% of transport mode revenue. Those numbers explain why trucking costs matter beyond the trucking industry. When one mode of transportation carries most domestic freight tonnage, its cost structure reaches many parts of the economy. Retail goods, food, building materials, farm products, household supplies, and e-commerce packages all depend on movement, and much of that movement depends on diesel. The effect can be direct for businesses and indirect for households. A carrier pays more for fuel. A shipper faces higher fuel surcharges or higher freight rates. A distributor pays more to move goods to a warehouse or store. A retailer manages higher transportation costs. Some costs may be absorbed. Some may be delayed. Some may be passed forward. The consumer may not see the chain, but the chain still exists. That is the basic structure behind diesel pressure. Higher diesel prices raise transportation operating costs. Higher operating costs can raise freight spending. Higher freight spending can pressure businesses that move goods. Business cost pressure can eventually reach households through the prices of everyday goods and services. The connection is not automatic and it is not always immediate, but the pressure is real enough to matter. Distillate inventories add another layer. Diesel is part of the distillate fuel category. EIA explains that distillate fuel oil includes both diesel used in vehicles and home heating oil. In September 2025, EIA warned that lower distillate inventories elevate the risk of higher prices and price volatility from supply disruptions, especially during high-demand periods such as autumn harvest and winter heating season. That warning does not mean a shortage is guaranteed. It means the supply cushion matters. When inventories are lower, the market has less room to absorb disruptions, demand spikes, refinery issues, or other pressure points. A thinner cushion can make prices more sensitive. For ordinary people, distillate inventory data may seem far removed from daily life, but it connects to the systems that keep goods moving and, in some regions, homes heated. If diesel and related distillate markets become more volatile, businesses that rely on them may face more unpredictable costs. Those costs can affect planning, contracts, delivery schedules, and pricing decisions. EIA also said U.S. total distillate inventories were forecast to end 2025 and 2026 at multi-year lows because of 2025 inventory draws, strong export demand, and domestic production declines tied to refinery closures. That adds a structural layer to the story. Diesel prices are not only about the weekly pump number. They are also about inventories, exports, refinery output, and production capacity. A lower inventory cushion can raise risk. Strong export demand can reduce domestic stock levels. Refinery closures can affect domestic production. Together, these factors help explain why diesel markets can become tight or volatile. Diesel prices were also part of a broader energy cost environment. In April 2026, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that the energy index rose 3.8% for the month and 17.9% over the previous 12 months. Fuel oil rose 5.8% in April and 54.3% year-over-year. Fuel oil is not the same as on-highway diesel, bought by truckers, but it is part of the related distillate environment. The broader point is that energy costs were rising during the same period freight and diesel pressures were visible. For businesses, energy costs affect more than transportation. They can affect heating, cooling, production, warehousing, refrigeration, and other operating expenses. For households, energy pressure often arrives through several channels at once. Some of it appears directly through utility bills or heating costs. Some appears indirectly through the cost of goods moved, stored, refrigerated, or delivered by energy-intensive systems. This is why diesel can be described as a hidden cost behind many things, but not as the only cost behind everything. That distinction matters. A grocery bill may reflect food supply, farm-level prices, processing, packaging, refrigeration, labor, rent, margins, diesel, and freight. A construction project may reflect materials, labor, financing, equipment, insurance, fuel, and transportation. A delivery fee may reflect labor, routing, vehicle costs, insurance, fuel, and demand. Diesel is part of many of these chains. It should not be treated as the single cause. The verified data supports a more careful conclusion. Diesel was expensive. Freight spending rose sharply. Trucking carries most domestic freight tonnage. Distillate inventories were a concern. Energy prices were rising. Taken together, those facts show diesel as a major hidden cost pressure inside the economy. That pressure affects different groups in different ways. For truckers, diesel is immediate. It changes the cost of every route. A higher pump price can reduce margins, affect contract negotiations, increase fuel surcharges, or change operating decisions. For carriers, fuel is one of the costs that can determine whether a route is profitable. When diesel rises quickly, companies may have to adjust pricing, capacity, or service patterns. For shippers, higher freight rates and fuel surcharges raise the cost of moving goods. That can affect budgets and planning, especially when volumes are not rising enough to explain the spending increase. For retailers, higher shipping costs can become part of inventory decisions, store pricing, supplier negotiations, and distribution strategy. For grocery distributors, diesel connects directly to the movement of food. It powers trucks, refrigerated trailers, and delivery routes between farms, processors, warehouses, and stores. For construction firms, diesel can affect heavy equipment, materials delivery, and job site logistics. For small businesses, higher delivery and freight costs can pressure margins. A local business may pay more to receive inventory, send products, make service calls, or operate vehicles. Some absorb the increase, some raise prices. Others adjust how far they travel or how much inventory they carry. For households, the pressure is usually indirect. A family may not buy diesel, but it buys goods moved by diesel. It buys food delivered through diesel-powered logistics. It pays for services that depend on vehicles and equipment. It buys materials, packages, and household products that move through freight networks. That is how diesel can reach the family budget without appearing on the receipt. The current status is clear. As of May 11, 2026, national on-highway diesel was $5.63.9 per gallon. The price was nearly flat from the previous week but sharply higher than a year earlier. California diesel was much higher, at $7.32.1 per gallon. West Coast diesel was $6.56.2 per gallon. The latest freight data showed that in the first quarter of 2026, shipper spending rose 12.9% from the previous quarter and 21.8% from a year earlier, while shipment volume was mostly flat. That combination matters. Fuel was expensive, freight spending was rising. Shipment volume was not rising nearly as much. Trucking remained central to the movement of goods. The pressure was not isolated. It was connected to freight capacity, fuel surcharges, rates, energy costs, distillate inventories, refinery-related production concerns, and regional fuel price differences. What remains uncertain is how long diesel prices will stay elevated and how much of the cost will be absorbed by carriers, passed to shippers, passed to retailers, or eventually reflected in consumer prices. That uncertainty matters. Cost pressure does not move through the economy in a straight line. Some businesses absorb it for a time. Some pass it forward quickly. Some negotiate contracts. Some reduce service. Some adjust routes, inventory, or pricing. The effect depends on the industry, region, contract, customer, and competitive environment. But the basic pressure remains. Diesel is one of the fuels that keeps the physical economy moving. It powers the trucks that move freight. It supports agricultural systems that produce food. It runs equipment used in construction. It helps move goods through warehouses, distribution centers, and delivery networks. When diesel costs more, movement costs more. And in an economy built on movement, that matters. For the middle-class household, the diesel story is not about buying diesel at the pump. It is about the cost of things that arrive because diesel was used along the way. Food on the shelf, materials at a job site, products in a warehouse, packages at the door, inventory in a small store, service vehicles on the road. Those systems are easy to overlook because they operate behind the scenes. When their costs rise, the effects can move outward. A higher diesel price becomes a higher operating cost. A higher operating cost becomes freight pressure. Freight pressure becomes business pressure. Business pressure can become consumer pressure. That is the economic chain. It should be described carefully. Diesel is not the entire inflation story. It is not the only force behind rising prices. It does not explain every household cost. But it is one of the most important hidden costs behind the movement of goods. Because everyday life depends on goods being moved, stored, delivered, cooled, stocked, and serviced, diesel remains a pressure point inside the cost of living. The numbers show that pressure clearly. Diesel above $5.60 nationally. California above $7.30. Freight spending up more than 20% from a year earlier while shipment volumes barely changed. Trucking carrying more than 70% of domestic freight tonnage. For ordinary Americans, those figures describe a system working in the background, not always visible, not always separated on the bill, but present in the cost structure behind groceries, retail goods, delivery, construction, and small business services. The hidden cost is not only the fuel itself. It is the movement the fuel makes possible. And when the cost of that movement rises, the effect can travel through the economy until it reaches the household budget.